Today's daf is daf lamed dalid, and yesterday we covered the Mishnah on daf lamed gimel and beis on the bottom, but we didn't do the Gemara, so we'll start 4 lines up before the end of lamed gimel amid beis. Tana Rabbana. Arvei nachal. The Gemara is now analyzing the pasuk that tells us to take amongst the 4 minim the arvei nachal, and notice 2 things about this phrase. Aside from the fact that absent is the word arava, we have to figure out that it's an arava, but notice that arve is in the plural. And we'll see the significance of that. Perhaps it might require that we take 2 aravos instead of 1. And that's why the plural is used. But more important for us right now is the word nachal, which sounds like hagedelim ala nachal, that it has to be grown next to a nachal, which is a body of water. And apparently, what the Bryce is trying to convey is that when you have water right next to the willow tree, then it's going to develop an arava, which is very beautiful and very healthy. The shape of a nachal is usually a little bit elongated. And that's the shape of the leaf of the aravas. We'll soon see that there's another fake arava, which is called the tzaftzafah, and its leaves are round rather than moshuch meaning elongated. Now Rashi makes a very important point over here. He says that when the Brisa says hagdelim al hanachal, that's only lechatchila. That doesn't exclude an arava that grew far away from it. It would only be preferable if you have all the ideal alternatives to take an arava that grew next to a nachal, and the Torah is just giving you a lechatchila. But there are many other aravos that don't grow; they grow out in the fields. They're nowhere near a nachal, and Rashi says they too will have the status of being valid for the mitzvah. However, when we get to the second part of this price, and that is that the Allah has to be shaped in a certain way, that's absolutely critical. Tanya Idach, we have another brisa, Arvei Nachal Einli Ella Arvei Nachal. Well, are you telling me, and this is not Rashi's interpretation, but Rashi came with Fuke, that it has to grow next to a nachal. And if it doesn't grow next to a nachal, it's possible. Shalbal, let's say, for example, I have an arava that grows out in the fields, it's not near a nachal, or v'shel harim, it's on the top of a mountain. Minayin, would that also be valid? Talmud lomar arvei nachal. B'kol makom. We indicated before that the plural, the use of the plural, the word arve, is to indicate you have to take 2 aravos. But this brisa has a different derivation from the word arve, that the word arve in plural is a ribui that's coming to tell you that not only is it an arava that grew next to a nachal that's kosher, but even an arava that grew in a field or a harim, that also is considered kosher. And it could be that the reason why this brisa allows itself to use the word arve to include other types of aravos, meaning aravos that didn't grow next to a menachal, is because this brisa reflects the sheet of Rabbi Akiva. We'll see later on that Rabbi Akiva, the next Mishnah, is only opinion that all you have to do is take 1 single arava. We're not familiar with that because we don't ask him like Rabbi Akiva. So clearly, Rabbi Akiva does not use the plural of the word arve to derive 2 aravos. He only requires 1 arava. So what will Rabbi Akiva, for example, do with the extra plural of the word arve? It could have said arava. It didn't have to say arve, but the answer is to expand your definition of arava to include even an arava that doesn't grow next to a body of water. And now, Rabbi said, we begin the daf for today, and that's Lamed Daled. Abba Shol Omer Arvei Shtayim. according to Abishol, we only need one arava. We don't need two. So why does the Torah say arve in the plural? And the answer is achas lelulav, the achas lemigdash. There are two different mitzvahs with regard to the arava. One mitzvah applies on the first day and only on the first day of Sukkot, and that's outside the Mikdash, in what we call the Gvulim, or the Medina. But there's another mitzvah to take the Arava, and that applies every single day of Sukkot. And that's called Hekef Arava. We're going to have full Sukkot later on in the Sukkah about the mitzvah of circling around the Mizbeach in the Beis HaMikdash, holding the Arava. And that's why the Torah uses the word Arava. And it only requires one. For Rabbanan Lemigdash Minoled, the Rabbanan did not deny that there is a mitzvah of taking the Arava in the Mikdash. From whence did they derive that conclusion? Since they need the word Arve to teach me that you need two Aravas. And where it says Hilchasa Gemirle, they have Halacha L'Moshe Sinai, which obviates the need for a source in the Torah. And it's reflected in a statement of Rav Asi in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. And this statement has three different halachos, or shall we say, three different mitzvahs perhaps, that are derived from halacha l'Moshe Sinai. And what would be interesting, not for us now, but in a more even shir, would be to discuss whether or not these mitzvahs should be counted in the Taryag. What is the status of halacha l'Moshe Sinai? Is it equivalent to a doraisa? Is it a Darabanan? Is it somewhere in between? That's a complicated issue. So let's skip Eser Netios for 1 minute. We'll come right back to that and go to the other two mitzvahs that we're familiar with. One is Arava. As we said, we're required to circle around the Mizbeach every single day of Sukkot holding an Arava. Then we have Nisach HaMayim, and it means that during the course of Chol HaMoed Sukkos, we would draw water from the Mei HaShiloach in a Kli Shares, and that would require that we take this water and we pour it on the Mizbeach. This is the only time during the year that we have a mitzvah of Nisuch, not with Yayin, but rather with Mayim. And later on in Masechet Sukkah, we're going to derive this from extra letters in the Torah, but that's only a post facto esachta. The real derivation of the mitzvah of Nitzach HaYayin is halacha l'Moshe Sinai. And finally, we have halacha in Shvius, this coming year is Shvius, called Eser Netios, which means that normally you're not allowed to plow your field during Shvius. That is one of the doraises in Shvius. And not only that, from Rosh Chodesh El, which we just passed, which is 30 days before Rosh Hashanah, before the year of Shvius, there's already a mitzvah called Tosefes Shvius. We have to begin implementing those prohibitions that apply in the field on Shvius already a month before Shvius. However, if there's a certain closeness, a close proximity of many different netios are not yet fully grown, they are immature saplings, and you have 10 in a certain limited circumscribed area, which is called a base saw. And a base saw is approximately, you can't be too particular with me about this, 2,500 square amos is a base saw. If you have 10 young trees within a certain small area, they're very immature, and the trees need a lot of attention, otherwise they'll dry up. And on Shvius, we're allowed to do that which will prevent the death of vegetation. You're not allowed to actively cause the growth of something during Shvius, but you're allowed to prevent something from withering away. And in this case, when you have 10 saplings, all of which are sucking up the nourishment, we have to make sure that there's going to be enough rainwater that seeps in after you plow the ground in these openings in the ground, such that these netios, which are fighting for each other, they're vying for that moisture, because there are 10 of them within a small, relatively limited area. Therefore, we're allowed to plow the ground. And this heter is derived from halacha l'moshe nisim. Torah Rabbanu, we learned in the Brisa. Arvei nachal hagdelos ala nachal. Now we just finished saying that it doesn't have to be so. And even an arava that grew in a field or on a mountain, it wasn't near a nachal, is also kosher. But what does this Brisa mean when it says gedelos ala nachal? As if to say, we have to exclude and disqualify any other arava. So the Brisa explains that this is going to exclude something called a tzaftzava. Prat l'tzaftzava hagdela bein haharim. Now, the fact that it grows on the mountains, that itself per se would not disqualify the arava. However, we'll soon see that the tzaftzava has three, shall we say, imperfections. I'll use that. Three negative dimensions in comparison to a regular arav. But hold off for that for just a minute. Amar Rabbi Zera, my kra. From whence do we know in the Torah or in Tanakh at least that the tzaftzava is being downgraded? It's being excluded, and we know it from a tochacha that is given by Yechezkel Hanavi in the name of Hashem, in which instead of comparing the Jewish nation to the classic arava, which grows beautifully next to water, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, castigating the people of Israel, says that you're behaving like a tzaftzava. And that's not a good thing, because a tzaftzava is an inferior species and it should be excluded. Hach al mayim rabim, but tzaftzava samam. Hach means God says, I've taken you as a people because you were meant to grow beautifully from mayim rabim, from lots of water. But instead, what I didn't get what I bargained for, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, I got a tzaftzava. Oh, that's what you set up. You set up a tzaftzava. Now, the question is, where do you put the comma? Amalei Abai says to Rabbi Zera, Vidilma, perhaps, Iruche Kamafarish. Maybe you have what we call in fancy English in a positive clause, Hach al mayim rabim, kama, umay niu, and what is a vegetation that grows with a vast amount of water, of hydration? That is a tzaftzava. How do you know that you divide this pasuk into two parts, separating Chach al mayim rabim from tzaftzava sama? Maybe we should combine the two parts of the pasuk. And tzaftzava samo is an answer to the question, well, what grows al mayim rabim? So this pasuk, says Abai, could not possibly be the source from which we downgrade the status of the tzaftzava. And Rabbi Zera defends himself, imkain my samo. According to you, Abaye, leave out the word samo from the pasuk. It should have said kach al mayim rabim tzaftzava. From the fact that it says set up a tzaftzava, it indicates that that two-word phrase at the end of the pasuk should be read independent of the first part of the pasuk. And therefore, God is saying kach al mayim rabim. What I meant to take as a nation for myself is mayim rabim nation. Instead, I got this tzaftzava. You set up a tzaftzava. And the Gemara now quotes someone else, another Amora, who actually interpreted this pasuk exactly the same way Rabbi Zera did. Amar Rabbi Avo, Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Ani Amarti, my plan was, you Yisrael, if God says I wanted my nation to be in my eyes, kikach, like taking al mayim rabim, taking a beautiful vegetation that grows abundantly. Umayniu, and what is that in our rough? I personally never got excited about it, but
say the word
well, only because the pasuk is contrasting what God ended up getting with that which He wanted. So apparently, those two things belong to the same species. So God says, My nidu arava. That's what I bargained for. Vehen, and what did the people of Israel do? Samul atzman kitzaftzufah shebaharim. They developed themselves like a tzaftzufah. We're going to see again. We'll see all the negative traits of a tzaftzufah in just a minute. Some say that this drasha is actually brought in a brayso. Here's the lashon of the brayso. That from this pasuk we see clearly that tzaftzufah is not considered an arava. Masechet Rab Zera. Now, according to this version, it was Rab Zera who raised the objection against the brayso rather than Abaye, who raised the objection of this drasha of Rabbi Zera. Vidilma Perusha Kamafarish. Maybe we should read it. Kach al Mayim Rabin. Ma'ininu, or what is Mayim Rabin? Tzaftzufah. And tzaftzufah is not to be downgraded. On the contrary, it's upgraded to the status equal to an arava. And the Gemara now is answering Rabbi Zera. Before we had Rabbi Zera answering himself against Abaye. Now it's Rabbi Zera who objects to the brayso on this drasha. Now the Gemara is defending the drasha. And came my samo. Why the extra word samo? Amar Rabbi Yavo, Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Ani Amarti Shiyu Yisrael Lefonai, Kikach Al Mayim Rabim, Ma'ininu Arav Vehem, Samu Atzman Kitzaftzufah Shebaharim. Okay. Honorable. Now we're going to learn what are the negative attributes, the faults of a tzaftzufah. Ezu arava ve'ezu tzaftzufah. Look at the beautiful arava. Number one, Kaneshala Adom, the stem from which the leaves grow is reddish. Number two, Ola Shalom Shuk. The leaves of the arava are elongated. And number three, Piu Chalak. Its mouth is smooth. It's not rigid. It doesn't look like a saw. We're going to soon see about a saw. And tzaftzufah has all the negative, opposite, antithetical traits. Number one, Kanashalo Lavan, it's white. It looks kind of gaunt, dreary, lifeless. I say this with a lot of emotion because my father was a darshan, and he had a whole drush about the Arava Jew. The Allah Shalah Agol, and its leaves are round. What's so bad about a round leaf that looks like a mouth? Okay, magal, I understand. You don't want to start up with a mouth that's very sharp. But what's so bad about Allah Shalom Agol? The concept of being a goal is sort of reflective of something that's very into itself. You know what I mean? It's not open. You come over to this person, you hope that maybe he will respond to a good morning. Hey, maybe he's before davening. He doesn't want to kiss you and hug you. But the idea of being long is better. It's an idea of reaching out. Asanya, domil magal kasha. What are you going to do with a brayso that seems to assume that if the aravam looks like a sickle, which certainly has sharp edges, it's kosher. And now you're telling me that the tzaftzufah is possible because it looks like a pia domil magal. It's full of these ridges. I think the fancy English word for it is serrated. Have you ever heard that word?
Yeah.
Serrated. Yeah. Doma lemasar, possible. Masar is a saw. I'll show you. He has two pictures here. One of a magal.
The magal doesn't have the.
Who wants to be in charge of finding the pictures? Oh, here it is. Look at this. I got colored pictures. All right, you have your own colored pictures. All right, if you need any extra colored pictures, you let me know. So the saw has like not sharp ridges, but it has like little boxes. Again, they're very small. I'm making them very large. So that they don't point in one direction or another. And it's interesting that that's a chisaron. That's a deficiency. And let's try to explain why. Omar Abaye, Tanya ahi bechilfa gila. So this is another type of an arava, and its leaves look like a sickle, which is a magal. A magal is a sickle. Now, the advantage of a sickle, although again, it's not your first choice, but at least the shape moves inwardly. Correct? A sickle looks like that, correct? So what happens is that all of these serrated edges move towards the inside. And that's considered something natural in the way very often an arava and its leaves will grow in the case of gila. Gila, this is a very happy arava. Masha Ainkain, in contrast, you have another kind of arava, which looks like pia, domela masa. And masa means it doesn't point in one direction or another. It just goes like straight up, like serrated edges that go up. And that's not the natural way it grows. And that's a deficiency which is absolutely disqualifies the arava. So we're going to accept an arava that has leaves that are serrated, but they look like a sickle, as opposed to the serrated leaves of an arava that go straight up like a saw, like a masa. Omar Abaye, Shvamina hai chilfa gila koshelo shan. Abaye says that if the brisa, in the case of pia doma lamago, validates the willow, that means that a gila willow is kosher. Mara says, Chita, you're just repeating exactly what you told us, that pia doma lamago means a gila willow, right? Maldatev, you might have thought, Hoil the Islay Shem Levi, Lonis Kasha. Who remembers that we spoke about, was it 2 days ago, about a hadas that comes from Mitzrayim? Remember that instead of having 3 leaves on one level, it has 7 leaves. Do you remember that? No? That was the Egyptian hadas. And the Gemara says it's kosher. And the Gemara asks, why would I think otherwise? Adarab, it has more leaves than your classic hadas, which only has 3. It has 7. Give it a yashikara. So the Gemara answers because it has a shem levi, right? There's another description that's added to its name. You don't call it a hadas, which in Aramaic is called an asa, but you call it asa mitzrayma, from Mitzrayim. That might put it into a special separate category. Here also, you've got a gila chilfa arava. It's not your classic arava. It's got a name that describes it. So the Gemara says, Kamash Malan, according to Abaye's Chiddush, it's still kosher, despite the fact that it has a Shem Levi. So the Gemara asks, shouldn't we argue the way Abaye thought Nahavamina, that the Shem Levi sets up this arava from gila chilfa as a separate category, a new min, and it's not really an arava. And the Gemara answers, Arve Nachalam Rachmanu Mikol Makom. And we go back to that brisa that reflected the opinion of Rabbi Akiva that all you need is one arava. So why the plural of the word arve? And just like we said, it includes even aravos that grow on dry areas, meaning up in a mountain or in a field. So too, it's coming to include that which has a shem levi. It is a member of the species of arava. It's called a gila chilfa gila. Omar Avchizda Hani Tlas Mili Ishtani Shmayayu Michicharim Beis Hamikdash. Now we're going to have a whole Gemara here about names or words that describe articles and those words have changed over the course of time. So a word X now means Y, and Y now means X. And this is the development of language. We have a fellow who davens here. I haven't seen him lately during COVID, but his name is Moses. He's an expert in the science of language development. Now, what this has to do with the Churban of the Beis Hamikdash, I have no clue. I think the Gemara is just using that as a division of errors, of periods of time. So, for example, and again, we're going to have from Rav Chisda no less than 3 examples. Later on, we'll have Abaye with a whole bunch of other examples. Rav Chisda's example is Chalfita, Chalafta, Aravta. That which was called originally Chalafta has now been called Aravta. And that which was originally called an Aravta is now called a Chalafta. So the Gemara immediately intervenes in the middle of Rav Chisda's presentation. I mean, we're not studying language development now. And the answer is Lululav. Meaning that from now on, if you look for an Arava for your Lulav, then look for something that's called a Chalafta. Why? Because that which was really an Arava, and back in the day was called an Arava, today it's called a Chalafta. So a Chalafta today is the Arava of yesterday. And the reverse is going to be excluded. Another example, Shipura, Chatzotzros. Shipura is a shofar, and Chatzotzros, as you know, are those trumpets. If you go to the area before the Kotel during, the period of Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, you'll see that there's this machon there. You're familiar with it, but machon Hamikdash. You know what I'm talking about? Yeah. So they're already creating the kalim for the mikdash. I don't want to say anything. I'm not a big fan. Yeah. I think it's political. It's not halach. We have no mitzvah to create kalim now. Sorry. But in any event, so you'll see they created chatzotzos. And if you're lucky, you'll hear them blow these long trumpets. And now the name of shofar, which used to be called a shofar, is now called chatzotzra, which is also for shofar, but yet it's kosher for shofar. Why? Because it's really a shofar. And that which was a chatzotzra, now they call it a shipura. A trumpet they call by the name of shofar. You need a shofar for Rosh Hashanah. Don't buy a shofar. If the guy is selling you a shofar, don't consider buying it. If he's selling you a chatzotzra, then you should buy it. And Ptorta, or these 2 words were exchanged. Okay, so now we're dealing with buying and selling. And there are 2 types of tables. This is based on Rashi and Masechet Shabbos. There's a larger table and a smaller table. And he ordered a larger table. You can't deliver a smaller table. It reminds me of, what do they call it in English? Those small, okay, I'll ask my wife. She's into, furniture and all that stuff. It's a French word. You know what I'm talking about? Like they have larger tables, but then you have these beautiful, it's almost there for artistic purposes, though. Like a coffee table, yeah, but that's not what I have in mind, but okay. Omar Abai Afani Omar. I want to add my words that have been changed to the list. Beikase, huvlila beikase. So this has to do with what's called malagera. You know that an animal that has 2 stomachs is a kosher animal because it's malagera. So the food first gets chopped up and then it goes into one stomach, and then from one stomach it goes into another stomach. And there are various parts of the kishkis of the animal that could make the animal into a treifa if we find a hole in that area, in that part of the animal. So we really have to define and identify that which is called Bei Kasi. Because if there's a hole in the Bei Kasi, then it's one of the Yud Ches Trefos. In the Gemara in Chulin, there's a whole parak called Elu Trefos. And any one of those simanim will indicate that the animal is going to die within a limited period of time. It has such an injury to a vital organ that it cannot live past, let's say, a year. And one of these areas is called the base hakosa. Nafkamina lemachad hanimsa biovi base hakosos. So the base hakosos is the part of the animal where the waste products start being taken out. I guess kind of like the colon. Anyway, it's a very thick part of the animal. It has an outer skin that's very thick and an inner skin that's very thick. And normally, if you find a machat, you find that the animal swallowed a needle and it created a puncture. So with Bei Kasi, we have a special kula that because of the thickness of the membrane that covers this area, therefore it still is kosher. It's not a treifa unless it was punctured through and through, both the inner and the outer walls of this particular base hakosos. So it's very crucial that, if somebody calls it a base hakosos, it's a base hakosos filled with treifa. But in truth, if he calls it a base hakosos today, it's not a base hakosos. Only if he calls it huvlila. Okay, huvlila is another part of the animal that is also very similar to this part of the animal, but in fancy English, he says it's called an amasu, omasu, and that is called in Aramaic a huvlila. And then there's another part of the animal which is called a Bei Kasi. He calls it a reticulum. I'm probably not pronouncing it right. Anyway, you have to take anatomy. You have to take anatomy. Doc, you took anatomy? Okay, if you still remember your anatomy, I'm very impressed. Because my son told me that after he took his exam in anatomy, ask him 24 hours later, he probably failed miserably. Like anatomy is just like memorized in different parts. A day later, you forget it. Anyway. Now, Rabbi Bar Yosef wants to add another thing to the list. Afaniyam, let me say my shtick. Bavel Bursif. Bursif, Bavel. The name of Bavel has changed. It used to be called Bavel. Now it's called Bursif. And Bursif is Bavel. The Mainaftimina.